Okay, St. Augustine, who lived from 354 AD to 430 AD, follows on the heels of his predecessor, whose name was Plotinus, who lived from 204 to 270 AD. So these are the first two big names in the history of medieval philosophy. First Plotinus, and then St. Augustine. So it's good to contrast these two thinkers and to see how St. Augustine took another path, how he appropriated his great predecessor, Plotinus, and the direction that he took it. So I'm going to make a series of 4 very short lectures on St. Augustine. The first one will be on Augustine's idea of God. The second one will be on his notion of the world. The third one will be on his view of man and knowledge. And the last one on his ethics. So let's think about St. Augustine's view of God. Well, the first thing to do before any study of St. Augustine, anyone interested in his thought should just look at his biography and look at his life to a certain degree. And then just look at his works, the incredible breadth of his works and the proliferation of so many works. So that gives you a kind of connection with the thinker, and even though you haven't read all those works, you get a feeling for what he was interested in. But the 3 most important ones are the City of God, the Confessions, and on the Trinity. So let's think about what St. Augustine's view of God. Well, in a word, we need to unpack this word. St. Augustine thought that God was being itself with a capital B, okay? But this sets him aside from Plotinus, who was more of a Platonist. Both Plotinus and Augustine were Platonists to a certain extent. But Plotinus followed Plato in believing that the divinity, the Godhead, is beyond being. If you study Plato's thought, you'll see that what Plato called the idea of the good is beyond being. And Plotinus follows Plato on that point. But St. Augustine thought that through himself and thought, no, God is being. So that's a big difference. For Plotinus, the first principle and the ultimate is the one, that is being. I'm sorry, that is beyond being for Plotinus. So for Plotinus, the one is not a being, but beyond being. That's an important point. I know it sounds simple just to say it, but if you try to wrap your mind around that, it becomes quite a difficult idea to conceive of something that's beyond being, because thought can only think beings. Representational thought can only make a representation of something. And when we speak, even if I say the word God, God refers to something. Well, something is being. But then what can I say about that which is beyond being? Well, I can't say anything. Be still and know that I am Lord, it says in the Psalms. But St. Augustine has a different idea. When Moses asked asked God, who shall I say sent me to them? The whole notion, the story of the burning bush. And the voice came to him, tell them, he who is hath sent you to them. So Augustine interprets that to mean that God is he who is. So what does that mean? God is he who is. Well, God is the only being whose essence is existence itself. Okay, so I am who am. Tell them he who is hath sent you to them. That's my name. So that means that the essence of God is existence itself. Well, existence itself, for Augustine, is being. Naturally, Augustine admits that God is one, as did Plotinus, but he doesn't subordinate the one to any other reality, as Plotinus does. For Plotinus, there's a trinity, but the trinity are three individual persons. There's the one, which is beyond being, that's Plotinus. But then there's the second principle, the intellect, which he calls nous, following Plato. The word nous in Greek means mind. And then there's the world soul. That idea is a wonderful idea taken from Plato, also by Plotinus. Plato has this idea of the world soul, that this universe is built like a human body, and it's a living being. And this living being has a soul, and this soul is the world soul. So there are these three independent entities. There's the one, which is beyond being. There's nous, or intellect. And there's the world soul. And they form a kind of hierarchy, three ultimates. For Augustine, the three parts of the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, are all one. So they're all aspects of the one. The way I like to think of it is when you think about aspects, think about what an aspect is. An aspect is a particular view of something, but one could take another view of that same thing and it's still the same thing, but you're taking another view of it. You're seeing another aspect of that same thing. So the three parts of the Trinity are three aspects of one and the same being for Augustine. It's a logical point, actually. Like, I could be the brother to my sister and I could be the son to my father. So who am I? Am I a brother or am I a son? Well, obvious answer is I'm both. But I'm a brother in relationship to my sister. I'm a son in relationship to my father and my mother, right? Or a husband in relation to my wife. I'm all those things. That's just a logical point. Now, taking that same way of thinking, the three parts of the Trinity are just three aspects of one and the same being. And that's Augustine's view of the Trinity. He believes in the equality of the three persons of the Holy Trinity. And so he embraces the unity of their essence. For Plotinus, on the other hand, the one differs markedly from Augustine's theology of being, because for Plotinus, the first three universal causes or parts of the one do not share the same essence. They don't share the same ousia, as in Greek. Whereas for Augustine, the three divine persons are one single being, one single God. So that's the first thing we need to think about. So that's one way in which he diverges from his great predecessor, Plotinus. So this fundamental divergence obliged Augustine to attribute a new meaning to the doctrinal elements which he borrowed from Plotinus. While, as he says, correcting his separating the three beings. For instance, in Plotinus, being can appear only after. And by after, he means ontologically, in terms of being, and temporally, that is chronologically. Being can only appear after the one, with the intellect, which fully deserves the title being, coming next, both ontologically and temporally. So ontologically means in terms of fundamentality, what's most fundamental. So for Plotinus, it's the one, the Godhead beyond being. And then there's being, which is nous. But for Augustine, God the Father is being in his own right. So Augustine applies to God the Father the idea of being in terms of one of his aspects. So the two main attributes of God for St. Augustine are unchangeability and immutability. So both of those are quite close. Unchangeability, actually, there's two. I'm sorry, I need to correct myself. One is eternity. The other is immutability. Immutability and unchangeability are the same thing. Something that's mutable is something that's changing. So unchanging, immutable, those are synonyms. And the other is eternity. So he holds on to those two. Those are the two most fundamental aspects of God for St. Augustine: eternity and immutability. All the other attributes or accidental qualities that we attribute to God are based on those two. That he's supreme, excellent, supremely powerful, all merciful, all just, the ens realissimum, the ens perfectissimum, the most real, the most perfect, all these qualities, omniscience, omnipotent, all those are based on the eternity and immutability of God. Infinity is usually not mentioned by Augustine, except in connection with the incorporeality of the divine being, that it's pure spirit, immutable and eternal. So those are the only times he'll speak of infinite, not finite. So in Plotinus, the main metaphysical problem was the relation of the one, which we already said was beyond being for Plotinus, to the manifold beings of the world. And these manifold beings of the world in relationship to the two other ultimate realities, namely nous and the world soul. But in Augustine, it's the relation of what remains immutable through all eternity, namely God, to the ceaselessly becoming unfolding of reality, of creatures in time. So it's that same question, the way I see it, that the early Greeks were thinking of. What is the relation of the one to the many being the flow of becoming? Augustine was himself aware of the radical difference between his own and Plotinus's conception of the main metaphysical problem. He has Plotinus in mind when he says, we do not speak of two or three principles. He has Plotinus in mind there. When we speak of God, no more than we are permitted to speak of two or three gods. So for Augustine, the relation between God and the world, between eternity and time, between immutability and the mutable, is a very subtle and complex relationship. So let's get inside of that subtlety and complexity a little bit more. let's look into the relation between God and the manifold creatures. And by the way, as I proceed with this conception of St. Augustine's view of God, I'm going to deliberately restrict any kind of critical remarks. The whole process of philosophical reflection has to do with, the way I see it, there are stages of understanding something. This is just a little digression, and we'll get back to God. When you try to understand some deep and speculative ideas, the first thing to do is just put the pieces together, like we're doing now. Plotinus has these three ultimate realities. Augustine has one, and for Plotinus, God is beyond being, and so on. That I call that putting the pieces together. The second level of understanding is trying to understand what it means. For that, you need a good secondary text, somebody who's spent their life doing research on this and with a PhD in this field. And then you listen to them, you read the primary text, listen to a good secondary text. It's hard to know what a good secondary text is until you mature in a field. Then you can start. It's like anything. How do you know if it's a good doctor or not? Or you have to rely on the reputation and so on. In academia, usually if things are published in book form and they're published in university presses like Oxford University Press or Cambridge University Press or Northwestern University. Universities have their own presses, and they don't publish things unless they're top notch. And usually they get better as time goes by, unless they're like classical texts, that are just so good that the secondary text itself becomes a classic, like Gilson in medieval philosophy. So, and then there's another level is of understanding philosophical text is to assimilate. Before assimilation, there's critical reflection. I call it evaluation. So first put the pieces together, then interpretation, which is an attempt to understand what the person is saying. Then you need to evaluate it. So that's critical thinking. You need to ask yourself what you agree with, what you disagree with. What part do you think is just nonsense? What part is just half truth? What part is, and that's going to change as time is, as you mature as a thinker. That's called critical thinking. That's called evaluation. But then there's another step even beyond that. I call it assimilation, where you assimilate your own evaluation of your interpretation of the pieces that you've put together. So that's a nice little process of understanding. So what I'm going to do, just to help keep things clear, I'm going to deliberately restrict from any critical reflection. Okay. Okay, so let's get back to, let's look at this relation between God and the manifold creatures for St. Augustine. What's the relation between eternity and time, basically, or between being with a capital B and becoming, or mutability or immutability and mutability? So what is this relation? Well, among the many attributes of God, as I just said, two are of particular importance for Augustine, namely immutability and eternity. St. Augustine goes on to say that with respect to humans, God is both light and beatitude. In himself, God is eternity and immutability. So he's distinguishing between who God is in himself or itself and how God appears to humans. So these are two different things, because humans have a particular mental apparatus by which we understand things, and we're finite, so we can only know so much. So there's the God as he is in himself, and then there's the God that appears to humans. For humans, God is light, life, and beatitude. But in himself, he's eternity and immutability. So he turns to St. John, the disciple St. John. I like to make a distinction between John, the disciple who wrote the gospel, and John of Patmos, who wrote Revelations. Whether or not these are two different persons, that's a whole controversy. Again, let me hold back my criticisms. But right now, he's talking of John, the disciple. So if you read the gospel according to John, it begins in the beginning was the Word. And the word that's being translated as word from Greek is logos. In the beginning was the logos. And the logos was with God, and the logos was God. That's John's. See, there was this notion of logos. You students know this by now, since we've studied it so carefully in Heraclitus. It was big with the Stoics too. We haven't studied the Stoics, but the notion of logos was very important for the Stoics. And so John uses the same word, logos, which is the name of the ultimate. But he provides a very important provisio, namely that this logos is Christ. So the gospel according to John says that in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God. It was the logos, and the logos was with God, and the logos is God. So the logos then is the light that enlightens every human being that comes into the world. Philosophically speaking, this means that the logos, or the Word, is the living and eternal thought of God the Father. Augustine goes on to say that all human beings, insofar as they are human and have any element of rationality, have within themselves this thought of God. Of course, the notion of atheism doesn't come up. But even atheists have some idea of God that they reject. Atheist means they have a concept of God and then they reject believing in that. So whether you're an atheist or a theist, the idea is in your mind, in human minds, Augustine thought. All human beings, insofar as they are human, have within them this thought, that is the thought of God. So the Word is the self-knowledge of the Father. It's God the Father knowing himself. It's God the Father conscious of his own self. As such, this Word is God's perfect image and resemblance. It's the perfect expression of God the Father. This logos, moreover, contains within itself, or rather is itself, all the intelligible patterns or reasons of all that is capable of existence. Now this, if it helps if you've studied Plato and Plotinus, but it's in Plato. The idea that in Plato, there's this idea of the one, the idea of the good, which is beyond being. It contains all these ideas in itself. He calls them divine ideas. And those are the patterns or archetypes of all the things of the world. The things of the world only are copies of these divine ideas. So there's this notion of truth at work here. Truth is correspondence. Between what? When somebody says something and it corresponds to reality, then it's true. But that correspondence to reality has to correspond with the idea that God has in his mind of that thing. So there's like a twofold correspondence. When I say something, the meaning of what I say corresponds to reality. And that reality corresponds to the divine ideas. So the divine ideas are the ground of truth. So this word, this logos, contains within itself all these intelligible patterns or reasons. It seems to me that Augustine is trying to distance himself from this language of Plato, but they're the ideas in Plato. He calls them reasons or intelligible patterns. It's just a circumlocution for the same words. So these are the eternal intelligible patterns or models, and he calls them divine ideas. He knew that the word idea, eidos in Greek, comes from Plato, but it was Plotinus who had conceived the second divine principle, the intellect, or nous, as the place of the divine ideas. And so Augustine takes from Plotinus this idea that the ideas are contained in the divine mind. Only for Augustine, the divine mind, or nous, is one with God. It's not an independent being. So after Augustine, then, this notion of the divine word, conceived of as full of these divine ideas, after whose pattern God has created the world, became the common property of practically all the Christian theologians. To almost all theologians who followed after Augustine, these divine ideas residing in the divine intellect are the very wisdom of God, who is the worker of all things and who reaches everywhere by reason of his purity. By purity is meant incorporeality, beyond space, beyond time, beyond place. In my mind, a place is the unity of time and space. In short, then, the word, the logos, is the light of the world because God is the source of its intelligibility, of its order, and also of its beauty. We'll return to the idea of beauty in a moment. So for Augustine, the word is that which enlightens human minds. Plato, and after him, Plotinus, had clearly seen that in the world where things are only images, true knowledge is impossible unless the knowing intellect relates things to the divine ideas, to these models, which are the divine ideas. So this is why St. Augustine contends that Plotinus agrees with St. John in teaching that, as he says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He is the true light and enlightens every man that comes into the world. So the relation between God and the world, between eternity and time, between immutability and the mutable, is that God is the light and life of the world by virtue of his word, of his logos. Just as God is light and life by his word, he's also beatitude. This is an incredible idea. If you begin to assimilate it too, it becomes really powerful, that last stage of understanding. Remember, put the pieces together, try to understand what it means with the help of others who have seen more deeply than you, and then respond critically, and then assimilate your critical interpretation of your understanding of those key ideas, these key things you've put into place. So this is one of those, that God is beatitude. What can that mean? The beatitude of God for Augustine has to do with the love of the Father and the Son, that is, the Holy Spirit. For beatitude is love of absolute truth, which is the absolute knowledge of absolute being, which is the supreme good. So beatitude, or joy, is love of absolute truth. And since absolute truth is absolute knowledge of absolute being, and since God is absolute being, then God is beatitude itself, and the only cause of beatitude for us. So for Augustine, human beings can be truly happy only in adhering with their whole heart to the immutable truth and wisdom whose stability alone can redeem them from perpetual becoming in time. When we become fully connected to the ground of truth, then automatically we become sensitive to this beatitude, because God is bliss. So there's the happiness that comes when you get what you want. And then when we don't get what we want, we become unhappy. But this kind of beatitude is different. It comes when we become sensitive to divine influences. So it's a matter of, it's not about getting what you want. It's not when your will is not thwarted and you want something and then you get it. That usually makes people happy. That's human happiness. This kind of happiness is divine happiness, and it comes when we become poor in spirit and open to the ground of truth. Let's look a little more at this relationship between God and the world for St. Augustine. Augustine maintains that the world of creatures, that is the temporal, mutable world, that is the manifold world of becoming, of which humans are but one instance, this world of creatures reflects and manifests God, even if it does it in an indefinite way, inadequate way. Augustine says, if anything worthy of praise is noted in the nature of things, whether it be worthy of slight praise or great, it must be applied to the most excellent and ineffable praise of the Creator. So whatever is praiseworthy, that praiseworthiness is a reflection of the ineffable praiseworthiness of divinity. He goes on to say, creatures always tend towards non-being. They are, in a word, finite. But as long as they are, even in their finite becoming, they possess some form of being. This relative form of being is a reflection of the ultimate form of being, which neither declines nor passes away. So there are reflections of divine form, of the divine forms of God. All that is praiseworthy is a reflection of the divine forms of God, who is absolute being. The order and unity of nature. Okay, this is an important idea. The idea that nature unfolds in an orderly fashion. The seasons come and go, the days come and go, the tides come and go, the moon waxes and wanes, and there's an order. The planets move in their orbits. This order is a reflection of the divine order. The order and unity of nature thus proclaims, he says, the unity of the Creator. Just as the goodness of creatures, their positive reality, reveals and reflects the absolute reality, the absolute goodness of God. On the other hand, God is the self-existent, eternal, and immutable being. And as such, he is incomprehensible. So this is a big idea in theology, in medieval, that since we're finite, when we try to conceive of God, it goes beyond our recognition. But this need not be a bad thing. For the mystics now, this is not so strong in St. Augustine, but for the mystics, this fact of the transcendence of God, of the incapacity of the human mind to encompass the encompassing, what that brings about is this state of being open to the mystery. But to what extent Augustine moves in that direction would take careful consideration of the primary text. But he does say that God is incomprehensible. God is his own perfection, he says. God is simple, that is, he is without accidents. Accidents is it's not an accident like we think of an accident. It's a language this is called scholastic language. By the way, you should know that if you're studying medieval philosophy. Aristotle was such an influence on on medieval thought, that the language that they spoke sometimes used Aristotelian concepts in the way Aristotle used them. So for Aristotle, accidents are qualities or characteristics that are attributed to substances. So what Augustine is saying here is, since God is simple in the sense of a unity, there are no attributes that we can attribute to God. It's just essence. So his wisdom, knowledge, goodness, and power are perfect and simple. They're not attributes attributed to some substance. So God transcends space by virtue of his spirituality and simplicity. And he transcends time too, by virtue of his eternity. Augustine says, God is himself in no interval nor extension in place, but his immutability and preeminent might is both interior to everything, because all things are in him, and exterior to everything, because he is above all things. So too, there's no interval, no extension in time, but his immutable eternity is older than all things, because he is before all things, and younger than all things, because he is after all things. So for Augustine, therefore, the relation of God to the world, of the Creator to his creatures, is one of transcendence as well as immanence. Here, I'm going to, again, restrain myself from any criticism, but the immanence of God is an important concept to me and should be to anyone, because what that means is immanence means within. So if God is within everything, that makes things be sacred. But if God is purely transcendent, transcendent means beyond, then the sacred is taken out of the natural world, of the world of time. And this changes humans' relationship to things, to creatures. If you think creatures are just things, desacralized, then you treat them however you want in order to use them. You just use them as means and never as an end unto itself. So the question of the immanence of God is an important issue. It's just good metaphysics to say that God is both transcendent and immanent. Because if you say God is all just transcendent, then he can't be omnipresent, but that's another aspect of God. If you say God is purely immanent and not transcendent, then it makes God finite, because the temporal world, the material world, is finite, and God can't be finite. So how can it be that God is both transcendent and immanent? That's good metaphysics. Well, Augustine does a good job in showing that God is transcendent in his purity, simplicity, incorporeality, eternity, immutability. All those words show the transcendence of God. He's very strong on that, being a Neoplatonist. But what about the immanence idea? Well, this would take a study unto itself, but it would be a worthy study. But just this one passage that I quoted from, where he says, God is himself in no interval nor extension in place, but in his immutability and preeminent might is both interior to everything, because all things are in him, and exterior to everything. And still, theologians claim that St. Augustine claims that God is immanent. So this would be a good study, and it's beyond the scope of my talk now. The degree to which we can say with any legitimacy that for St. Augustine, God is both transcendent, we can say that clearly enough, but the immanence question is an important one. It's an important one because of the implications of that. Because if you separate the creator from the creatures, then you desacralize time and the material world. Then it becomes just like a big gas station in outer space, and you just use it however you want and abuse it until it's by using. But since we did, it's the whole question of environmental philosophy too. If you have 2,500 years of a notion of divinity that transcends nature, then nature is just an object standing there waiting to be used by man. And of course, after the 2.5 millennia, we're going to find ourselves in an environmental crisis. So all these things are connected. It sounds like, speculative theology is just so far removed from questions of environmental concern. But people are shaped by their view of what they think reality is. And if they inherit ideas that take the divine out of the natural world, then they're left with a view of nature that's desacralized, desacred. And then nature just becomes objects standing there waiting to be used by man and disposable. So these are some of the implications of that. But he does say that God is immanent. So God is, the most salient aspects of God are eternity, that is beyond time, no beginning, no end, no passing, and immutability, beyond space, and no changing form. While at the same time, and here's the rub that would, for me, beckons critical thinking. He is interior to all things. And from that, he claims that God is immanent. He remains within all things without being affected by them, without undergoing their changes in time and space. So is there a concept of immanence where God can be within everything, but at the same time that withinness is disconnected from the things? This is the big question. But let's leave that for now. We're not going to answer that now. So for Augustine, God knew all things which he was to make. He doesn't know all things because he made them. Rather, God first knew the things of creation, and then they came into being in time. Now, all creaturely things have their ideas, or what Augustine calls their reasons, in God. And God, from all eternity, saw in himself, as possible reflections of himself, the things that he would create. He knew them before he created them, since they're in him and he is beyond space and time, and hence before creatures took place. Since the ideas are in God before creation, they're in him as exemplar, yet he made things as they exist, that is, as finite reflections of his divine essence. So God did nothing without knowledge. He foresaw all that he would make, but his knowledge is not distinct acts of knowledge, but, as Augustine says, one eternal, immutable, ineffable vision. So this is a sublime idea, that there's this one vision of past, present, and future, omniscient, divine mind. It is therefore by virtue of his eternal act of knowledge, which took place before creation, to which nothing is past or future, that God foresees even the free acts of men, knowing beforehand, for example, what we should ask of him, and when, and to whom he would listen and not listen. In other words, in contemplating his own essence from eternity, God sees in himself all possible limited essences, the finite reflections of his infinite perfection, so that the essence or reasons of things are present in his divine mind from all eternity, as in the divine ideas. In his Confessions, that famous book I told you about by St. Augustine, he teaches that the eternal reasons of created things remain unchangeable in God. He teaches that the divine ideas are certain archetypal forms or stable and unchangeable reasons of things, which were not themselves formed, but are contained in the divine mind eternally and are always the same. Thus, in God, the divine ideas are not distinct from his essence. These divine ideas neither arise nor pass away, but whatever arises and passes away is formed according to them. Therefore, creatures have real truth and reality insofar as they embody or exemplify the model in the divine mind. In this sense, God is truth and the standard of all truth. So we can try to make sense of that, these divine ideas. That, like, let's just take something like a tree, a blue spruce tree, and then a pine cone falls to the ground and a blue spruce starts growing because it fertilizes and begins to grow. When that blue spruce fertilizes, it takes the shape of a blue spruce tree. It doesn't take the form of any other kind of tree. So the way I understand this is all the forms of things, the fact that certain things take on a shape or a different form, and then they unfold and they go through their lifespan. Humans take on human forms, the different species take on their forms of plants and animals and whatever. These are formed according to the divine ideas that are contained in the divine intellect. In Plotinus, as I said earlier, these exemplary models, these divine ideas, are contained in nous, which is a separate entity. But for Augustine, the ideas are contained in the word, in logos, which, as we saw, is not, as in the case with Plotinus, a subordinate reality to the one, but rather is one essential dimension of the one, that is, the second person of the Blessed Trinity, equally substantial and in unity with the Father. Okay, so that's enough about the nature of God for Augustine, for our purposes. There's a lot more to it than that, but for our purposes, that I think we put our finger on the key ideas. Now, what about the existence of God? How do we know that God, that this nature really exists? What can stop, if an atheist were to read St. Augustine and wanted to be convinced that this God that Augustine speaks of truly exists, what would Augustine say? Well, there are three basic proofs for the existence of God in St. Augustine. And the third one is really a continuation of the first two. The first proof is the proof of God from eternal truth. The second one is the proofs that he offers from creatures and from universal consent of creatures. And the third one is the proofs that arise from the various proofs as stages of just one process. So let's look at these three proofs. The central and favorite proof of God for St. Augustine was proof of God from eternal truths. This proof is called the proof from within because it's based on and it arises out of thought, and thought is something within humans. The starting point of this proof is the mind's apprehension of the idea of a necessary and changeless source of truth. a divine idea, which, as Augustine says in his book on the freedom of the soul, thou cannot not call thine or mine or any man's, but which is present to all and gives itself to all alike. He's thinking of the thought of God in man's mind. And it's not anybody's possession. It's not thine or mine, but it's in all minds. The question that arises to me, and now I'm starting to think critically, what about the atheist? Does the atheist have a concept of God in his or her mind? Well, I don't know what Augustine says about that, but it could be that the atheist does have a concept of God, but rejects it. So the thought is still there, and that's all Augustine needs for his proof. This truth, for Augustine, moreover, is superior to the mind. That helps. Because if it's superior to the mind, then it doesn't matter what the atheist says. Are you following me? Because the atheist says, well, I have this concept of God in my mind, and I don't believe it. I reject it. But Augustine would come back and say, but the idea is something, by its very nature, is superior to the mind. So whether you reject it or accept it, whether you believe it to be true or not, that's not the point. The point is it's in your mind, and part of the idea is that it's beyond the mind. It's superior to the mind. Because our minds are forced to bow before the idea. Our mind did not constitute the idea, nor can our mind change the idea. So that's the answer to the atheist, now that I think about it. The mind at once recognizes that this truth transcends it and rules its thought, rather than the mind transcending it and ruling it. See, that's part of the idea, so that's how he gets around that. If it's superior to the mind and it rules the mind, then rejecting it doesn't make it go away, doesn't make it false. Because the very nature of the idea is that it's beyond the mind. It's superior to the mind. The mind can't rule the idea rules the mind. That's what Augustine would say to the atheist. For if the truth were inferior to the mind could change it. And if it were equal to the mind, it would be changeable like the mind. The mind varies in its apprehension of this truth, apprehending it more clearly now or less clearly later, whereas truth remains forever the same. And so Augustine contends in his book on the freedom of the soul, hence, if truth is neither inferior nor equal to the mind, nothing remains but that it should be superior and more excellent. Now, the eternal truth must be founded on being, reflecting the ground of all truth. Remember I said, in order to speak truly about something, there needs to be a correspondence with what you say and mean to the thing, and that thing has to correspond to the idea of the thing in God's mind. Just as human imaginations reflect the imperfection and changeable character of the human mind in which their images are grounded, and just as the impressions of sense reflect the corporeal objects in which they are grounded, so too the eternal truths in our own mind reveal the ground of truth. That is absolute truth itself, reflecting the necessity and immutability of God. And so, for example, if we judge an action that is more or less just, we must judge it in accordance with an essential and invariable standard. If I say, for example, that it's just to prolong life by any means whatsoever, irregardless of any circumstance, then I must have a standard of an essential and immutable standard that life must be prolonged despite any circumstances. So he's just pointing out here, whenever I make a judgment about something that's either right or wrong, there has to be a standard there. Or when I make a judgment about anything being true or false, there has to be a standard. But if there is an intelligible sphere of absolute truth, this cannot be conceived without a ground of truth, which is truth itself, in whom and by whom and through whom those things that are true in every respect. Thus, God exists as the ultimate ground of eternal and necessary truth. For eternal truth must be founded on being, and this being is the ground of all truth, that is, the absolute being, which is God. Basically, you can outline the proof this way. First, there are necessary and eternal truths in our mind. Second, all necessary and eternal truths must have a ground on the basis of which and through which and out of which it can be said that these truths are true. And this ground is being itself. Therefore, 3, there must be an ultimate ground of eternal truth, and this ultimate ground is God as absolute being. So that's proof of the existence of God from absolute truth. What about the second kinds of proofs that he offers? The proofs from creation and from the universal consent of creation. Well, he also proves the existence of God from the eternal corporeal world. These proofs are proclamations, he calls them, that all creation proclaims the God whom the soul can experience in itself, the living God. Augustine asserts that the primary inner compulsion of the soul is to seek happiness, but many are inclined to seek this happiness in something outside themselves. St. Augustine shows that creation cannot give the soul the perfect happiness that it seeks, but only points upward to the living God who must be sought within. Thus, when Augustine comments on the 73rd Psalm, he says, "How do I know that thou art alive, whose soul I do not see? How do I know? Thou wilt answer, because I speak, because I walk, because I work, fool." In other words, the very fact that you work, that you walk, that you speak, is a proof of the living God. I know thee to be living. Canst thou not by the work of creation know the Creator? That's still a quote from the Psalms. The idea is that these are called, usually in theology, what I was taught, these are called proofs from creation. Augustine, there's another one, the very order, disposition, the beauty, and the motion of the world and all the visible things silently proclaims that it could not have been made by accident. The ineffable and universally great and ineffability and invisibly beautiful is being reflected in the beauty of the world. So these are the arguments by creation. That's why when people look at the Grand Canyon or a meteor shower and they're aghast and they see this beauty and this order and it's the sublime. It leads them to this sense of awe about how could this have ever been made by chance or by nature itself. That the universe would be a chaotic, it wouldn't be a cosmos. By the way, the word cosmos means beautiful form. The notion of beauty is part of the very word cosmos. So it would be a chaos rather than cosmos. And the fact that it's a cosmos, there's a beauty to it and a sublimity to it, points to a creator, an omniscient creator. And again, when he comments on Genesis, he states that the power of the creator and his omnipotent and all-swaying strength is for each and every creature the cause of its continual existence. And if this strength were not at any time to cease from directing the things which have been created, at one and the same time, both their species would cease to be and their whole nature would cease to be. Here too, he's stating the fact and necessity of divine revelation, of the divine power within all things, sustaining them against the constant threat of non-being. The idea is that there's this constant threat of non-being, and that the very fact that things sustain themselves against the threat of non-being testifies to a force, a kind of compulsion to be, which is God itself. So God is the ground of existence. Augustine also gives what he has called the arguments from universal consent. This argument states that the nature of God is such that all power of God cannot be altogether and utterly hidden from rational creatures once it makes use of reason. For with the exception of the few, he says, in whom nature is excessively depraved, God, to be the author of the world, is one of his or her ideas. And even if the person thinks of a plurality of gods, he still attempts to conceive the one God of gods as something that which nothing more excellent or more sublime exists. So he concludes, all therefore concur in believing God to be that which excels in dignity all other objects. And there's a third kinds of proofs that he uses, and I'll just give you an outline form of that. It's been suggested by one of the greatest scholars of the philosophy of the Middle Ages. His name is Gilson, Gilson, that in the writings of St. Augustine, there is really only one long proof of God's existence, a proof which consists of various stages. So there are like four main stages. The first is initial doubt and the refutations of this doubt, which is something Augustine went through himself. Second, a consideration of the world of sense, and there he finds no discovery of truth. And then thirdly, the soul turns inward after it considers its own fallibility and changeableness. It discovers immutable truth, which transcends the soul and does not depend on the soul. And thus it's led finally to the fourth level, to God as the ground of truth and of the source of beatitude. Actually, that's an outline of St. Augustine's life, which follows the very unfolding of early Christianity from paganism to Christianity. So I'm a little rusty on my St. Augustine, but that's the best I can do for now. I told you my own orientation toward the Middle Ages. I gravitated towards the mystics, my favorite being Meister Eckhart. Later you might want to study Meister Eckhart. Hildegard of Bingen. There's St. John of the Cross, St. Francis, and others. Those are the big ones, though. The most intellectual is St. Meister Eckhart. And the one patron saint of nature and the most Christ-like of all the saints, my favorite, the Italian, the poverello, the poor little one, St. Francis. But that's what I said was accurate, and his view, St. Augustine's view of God and of the existence of God. So let's turn now to his view of the world and of knowledge, and then we'll look also at his ethics. So I'll make a bunch of these shorter, okay?